The immigrant genius who played by no one's rules. Long before the world knew him as the king of the bootleggers, George Remus was just a young German boy stepping off a boat into the foggy chaos of 1880s New York. Born in Landsberg, Bavaria in 1876, George was only 5 years old when his family fled Germany in search of the American dream. But dreams were expensive and the Remus family was poor. They settled in Chicago, a tough city built on ambition and grit. As a boy, George wasn't playing baseball in the streets. He was cleaning floors at his uncle's pharmacy. By the age of 14, he was managing the place. By 19, he was a licensed pharmacist himself. But Remus didn't stop there. Then came the real stroke of genius. In one legendary Chicago case, Remus introduced a concept that shocked the legal world: temporary insanity. It was risky, unheard of, but it worked. His client walked free. From that moment on, George wasn't just a lawyer. He was a courtroom magician. Money began flowing. Big clients, bigger cases, lavish office, fine suits, expensive cigars. But there was something else brewing. Not in courtrooms, but in Congress. The year was 1919. The United States had just passed the 18th Amendment, and the Volstead Act soon followed. Alcohol, making it, selling it, transporting it, was now illegal. But George Remus didn't panic. He saw gold in the shadows. Where most people saw a ban, Remus saw a loophole. According to the law, alcohol could still be used for medicinal purposes. Pharmacies could sell it. Doctors could prescribe it. And who better to understand both pharmacy and law than a man who had mastered both? This was the moment George Remus stopped playing by society's rules and started building his empire. He packed his bags, left Chicago behind, and moved to Cincinnati, the heart of America's whiskey industry. Why? Because it was close to bonded warehouses full of alcohol aging under government seal. To the outside world, George Remus was just another businessman. But behind closed doors, he was plotting something that would soon shake the very foundations of the Prohibition era. He set up companies, legal ones. He bought distilleries and pharmacies, registered under fake names, hired men to hijack his own liquor shipments, sold them on the black market, and within 2 years, he wasn't just rich. He was untouchable. A lawyer who became king of whiskey, Cincinnati, 1920. The city sat on the edge of something brewing, something forbidden, powerful, and intoxicating. While the nation celebrated the start of Prohibition, George Remus was settling into a new kind of life. He wasn't there for fresh air or scenery. He came for one reason only: to build an empire hidden in plain sight. The loophole was genius. The Volstead Act outlawed alcohol, except for medical use. Doctors could write prescriptions for whiskey, and pharmacies could fill them. That's where George Remus saw his golden door. He didn't just walk through it, he blew it wide open. He began buying up distilleries, bottling plants, trucking companies, and pharmacies, all under fake names, shell companies, and strawmen. He applied for legal permits to produce medicinal whiskey, then hired his own men to hijack his own trucks, stealing alcohol that was already his and flooding it into the black market. He called it a business. The government called it criminal genius, but no one could catch him. Remus's operation grew faster than anyone could have imagined. In less than 2 years, his network stretched across Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, and beyond. Whiskey, labeled as medicine, flowed like a river through speakeasies, nightclubs, and gangster hands. And then came the money, stacks of it, barrels, safes stuffed with cash. It's said that at the height of his reign, George Remus controlled 35% of all liquor in the United States. His income? Over $20 million a year, nearly $300 million in today's money. But it wasn't just the fortune, it was what he did with it. He bought a 60-room mansion in Cincinnati, later nicknamed the Marble Palace. Its gardens were fit for royalty. Inside, the floors gleamed with imported Italian marble. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks. Servants, chauffeurs, guards, Remus had created a kingdom, and he was its undisputed king. But the real show? Hi. That's right. The man who flooded America with whiskey. He was practically a teetotaler. For Remus, liquor was not pleasure. It was strategy, a tool, a product, a means to an end. But as his empire expanded, so did the risks. Competitors noticed. Federal agents whispered his name. Investigators were starting to ask the wrong questions. Too much noise, too much attention. But Remus had a solution for that too. Bribes. It's estimated that Remus spent over $500,000 in payoffs to judges, police chiefs, city officials, even federal prohibition agents. In courtrooms, his lawyers delivered confusing arguments. In offices, envelopes slid quietly across desks. Every time someone got close to exposing him, they'd suddenly drop the case or disappear altogether. George Remus wasn't hiding in shadows. He was glowing in the spotlight, untouchable. But even kings miscalculate. One mistake, one betrayal, that's all it takes to bring down an empire. And in Remus's case, the dagger came from someone he trusted more than anyone else in the world. The woman who took down a king by 1924, George Remus wasn't just rich, he was dangerously powerful. He had everything: wealth, fame, influence, and a loyal inner circle. But power can make a man blind, and Remus didn't see the betrayal coming. At the center of his empire was Imogen Remus, his wife, beautiful, poised, and fiercely intelligent. She wasn't just the queen of his marble kingdom. She was his business partner, his confidant, the woman he trusted with everything. Imogen helped manage his fortune. She knew the details of every bank account, every property deed, every bribe, every smuggled barrel of whiskey. And George trusted her completely. But the federal government had had enough. By late 1924, the Justice Department sent one of its top prohibition agents to bring Remus down. His name? Franklin Dodge. Cold, calculated, and ambitious. He wasn't just after Remus's empire. He was after glory. Dodge went undercover, and before long, he infiltrated Remus's world. It didn't take much. In 1925, Remus was arrested on over 3,000 counts of prohibition violations. The charges were massive, the evidence damning. He was sentenced to 2 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But behind bars, his mind was still working. George Remus knew the system better than anyone. He planned to serve quietly, then reclaim everything once released. What he didn't know was that his entire world was already crumbling from the inside. While Remus was rotting in prison, Imogen and Agent Dodge struck up a friendship, then a secret, then a romance. The federal agent sent to destroy Remus was now sleeping beside his wife. Together, Imogen and Dodge orchestrated a cold, calculated heist, not with guns but with signatures, forged documents, and bank transfers. Dodge resigned from the Justice Department, and the two began liquidating Remus's vast fortune. Properties were sold, bank accounts emptied, stocks, bonds, and gold gone. By the time Remus found out, 90% of his empire had vanished. But they didn't stop there. Imogen filed for divorce and offered him a small allowance, $100. From a man who once gifted cars like candy to being handed scraps. But that wasn't the final blow. No, the final dagger came when Remus received a message in prison. It was whispered, a warning. Imogen and Dodge weren't just stealing his money. They were plotting his deportation, trying to have him killed in prison, ensuring he never returned. George Remus didn't explode. He didn't scream or cry. He waited, like a viper in the grass, and then he was released. October 6, 1927, 2 years after his imprisonment, Remus stepped out of prison gates not as a broken man, but as a man with a plan. He had nothing left but his name, his rage, and a single mission: confront Imogen. He tracked her down to Cincinnati, where she lived in comfort with Dodge, surrounded by the ashes of the fortune she stole. She believed he was powerless, that she'd won. She was wrong. On the morning of their final divorce hearing, Imogene climbed into a taxi headed to court. George followed in his own car. At a stop in Eden Park, just beside the Springhouse gazebo, he cut her off. There were witnesses, pedestrians, a park full of people. But Remus didn't care. He stepped out of his car, walked toward her, pulled a .32 caliber pistol from his coat, and fired. One shot, right through her abdomen. She collapsed onto the gravel. Imogene Remus died hours later in the hospital, and the man who ended her life, he didn't flee. He calmly handed himself over to police and said 6 chilling words. "She ruined me, so I ruined her." The trial of the century, madness, media, and a 19-minute verdict. The city of Cincinnati stood still. Newspapers screamed with headlines. Radio buzzed. People gathered in coffee shops, train stations, and courtroom steps, desperate to hear every update from what quickly became known as the trial of the century. The charge? First-degree homicide. The accused? George Remus, former king of whiskey, fallen bootlegger, and now the man who shot his wife in broad daylight. The twist? George Remus decided to do the unthinkable, defend himself. No lawyers, no legal team, no high-priced defense. Just one man in a gray suit standing in front of a jury and daring them to understand him. And oh, did he make them understand. Remus opened with fire. He didn't deny what he'd done. He didn't sugarcoat it. He confessed to the shooting, but he didn't call it a crime. He called it a consequence, in his booming, steady voice. George looked at the jury and told them everything. How Imogene betrayed him. How she drained every dollar from his empire. How she colluded with a federal agent. How they tried to destroy him, frame him, even have him eliminated in prison. And how she mocked him when he got out, laughing behind polished windows in a house built with his blood and sweat. He said he lost his mind, that the betrayal, the personal and financial devastation, snapped something deep inside, that on the morning of the shooting, he was in a trance, a fog. His mind was gone, his thoughts spiraling in pain. He walked into Eden Park not as George Remus. They painted Remus as calculated, a man who'd built a liquor empire, bribed officials, outwitted the law, a man capable of manipulating juries, and this one was no different. But they underestimated what the jury saw with their own eyes. They saw not a gangster, but a man betrayed. Remus wept on the stand. He showed love letters between Imogene and Dodge. He exposed bank statements, wire transfers, forged documents, proof that she didn't just steal his fortune. She dismantled his life, piece by piece, and the jury felt it. The pain, the humiliation, the heartbreak. More than that, they believed it. The trial lasted for weeks, but the verdict? Just 19 minutes. The jury returned with a stunning decision. Not guilty. Courtroom erupted. Gasps, applause, outrage. Some people cheered, others stormed out. But Remus stood still, as if he expected it, as if he already knew. The state was furious. Public opinion split down the middle. Some believed justice had been served, that Remus was a victim who snapped under unimaginable pressure. Others saw it as a failure of law, a dangerous precedent where emotion overruled accountability. But legally, Remus was free. Not long after, he was sent to an asylum for mental observation. He remained there for just 6 months before doctors declared him sane and released him. The man who had once been behind bars for liquor and then nearly lost his life to betrayal was now truly free. He walked out not as a king, not as a gangster, but as a man who had done the unthinkable, faced the courts twice, and won both times. But freedom had a price. Remus was no longer a millionaire. The empire was gone. His name, though famous, carried the stench of scandal. And the golden age of bootlegging, That was fading fast. Still, the man who once threw parties for hundreds now lived in silence in a modest home in Covington, Kentucky. The question remained, was George Remus a legal genius or a devil in disguise? The ghost of Gatsby, exile, obsession, and the last breath of a whiskey king. The marble floors were gone. The orchestra had long stopped playing. The guests who once danced under golden chandeliers had scattered. And George Remus, once the king of the bootleggers, was now just another man fading into the silence of obscurity. After his stunning acquittal in 1927 for the public execution of his wife Imogene, Remus stepped into a world that had changed without him. Gone were the whispered deals, the fast money, the roaring nights of jazz and liquor. In their place was a shadow, and in that shadow stood a man with nothing left to rule. He didn't return to his palace. He couldn't. The infamous Marble Palace, his 60-room Cincinnati mansion that once symbolized untouchable wealth, had been stripped, sold, and scattered. The lavish estate had become a monument to excess and destruction, empty now, its marble walls echoing only ghosts. His fleet of Buicks, the solid gold watches, the flowing fountains of bourbon, all auctioned, liquidated, gone. And yet, George Remus survived. With the last of his dwindling wealth, he purchased a modest home across the river in Covington, Kentucky, a place so unremarkable it almost seemed like hiding. He remarried, not for power or ambition this time, but for stability. His bride was Blanche Watson, a quiet former secretary who had remained loyal during his downfall. He traded tuxedos for simple suits, public appearances for porch-side solitude. There were no more courtrooms, no more headlines, and yet he was never free. Because every man who builds an empire leaves behind ruins, and ruins whisper. Even as Remus tried to live a quiet life, running a small real estate office, answering to no one but his own ghosts, the past crept through the walls. The whispers didn't stop. Not in the streets, not in the back rooms of smoky speakeasies, not in the curious minds of America. The name George Remus still meant something. Something forbidden, something dangerous, something legendary. Even as new crime bosses rose, Capone in Chicago, Lucchino in New York, Remus remained the blueprint, the original, the myth. And then, literature came calling. In 1925, while Remus was sitting behind prison walls, F. Scott Fitzgerald published a novel that at first went largely unnoticed, The Great Gatsby. It told the story of J. Gatsby, a mysterious millionaire who threw wild, dreamlike parties and made his fortune through illegal means. A man obsessed with a woman who had once loved him and who betrayed him. Readers were captivated. Who was Gatsby really? Over time, the theories emerged. The glittering mansion, the over-the-top gifts, the bootlegging, the heartbreak, the obsession. It was all too familiar. Scholars began to connect the dots, and many came to believe that George Remus was the real-life inspiration behind one of literature's most tragic icons. Let that sink in. The man who flooded America with whiskey may also have flooded American literature with one of its greatest characters. Fitzgerald never confirmed it, but he didn't have to. The truth lived in the details. Just like Gatsby, Remus built an empire for a woman who would ultimately destroy him. Just like Gatsby, he tried to recapture the past. And just like Gatsby, he died a man surrounded not by enemies, but by silence. If Remus was Gatsby, then who was he after the book ended? He was a ghost, a fading legend. In his later years, visitors described him as distant, at times thoughtful, at times unsettled. He would stare out windows for long periods, as if watching invisible crowds, listening to music that wasn't there. His memory wandered, his body slowed, his spark flickered. He never returned to public life. He refused to speak much of Imogene. When asked if he regretted it, he often fell quiet. Some say he still loved her, even after the betrayal. Others say that shooting her was the final act of a man pushed past reason. Whatever the truth, Remus never truly escaped her shadow, and though he was no longer in newspapers, the government kept an eye on him, quietly, casually, just in case. The empire was gone, but the legend was still alive. In 1950, Remus suffered his first stroke. The man who once stood confidently in courtrooms with a booming voice now struggled to walk. He spent most of his time indoors, surrounded by a few loyal friends and his second wife, Blanche, who cared for him until the end. 2 years later, in 1952, George Remus suffered a second, more severe stroke. He was taken to the hospital. There were no journalists, no crowds, no curious spectators peeking in for a final look at the infamous bootlegger. He died in the quiet. No music, no marble, no headlines. Just a man in a hospital bed, once called the Napoleon of the bootleggers, now reduced to a footnote in the very city he once owned. He was 75 years old. There was no grand funeral, no ceremony. His grave rests quietly in Falmouth, Kentucky, unmarked by gold or diamonds. The man who once gave away cars now lies beneath the soil. His story almost forgotten. Almost, because legends, true legends, don't need marble statues. They live in stories, in whispers, in shadows. George Remus was a pharmacist, a lawyer, a criminal mastermind, a betrayed husband, a courtroom magician, and perhaps even the real Gatsby. He defied the law, then used it. He built an empire, then watched it burn. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was something in between. A reminder that in the right hands, the system can be played like a piano. And the line between genius and madness is razor thin. Even today, when the name George Remus is spoken, it isn't done loudly. It's whispered, like a secret, like a myth, like the distant sound of jazz, echoing from a party you were never invited to, but somehow still remember. Power, genius, obsession. George Remus wasn't just another bootlegger. He was a one-man empire. A man who mastered the law, then rewrote it. A man who built a kingdom out of whiskey and shattered it with a single bullet. But more than that, he was a mirror of his time, a reflection of America's wildest decade, the Roaring '20s, a decade of gold, glamour, crime, and collapse. While other criminals used fists and guns, Remus used courtrooms and contracts. While others ran from the law, he studied it, twisted it, beat it. In the end, George Remus wasn't undone by the government or by rivals. He was undone by love, by betrayal, by trusting the wrong person. His story reminds us that empires built on secrets eventually fall, that even the sharpest mind can be broken by the heart, and that sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought in streets, but in silence, between two people who once said forever. So when you hear the name Gatsby, think also of Remus, the man who really lived it. The man who didn't just dream the American dream, he hacked it and paid the price. This was the rise, the ruin, and the resurrection of George Remus.